I'd like to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Seema Jaitley, Managing Director of SJ Solutions. Seema has been specialising in pharmacovigilance for over 20 years and has headed up global pharmacovigilance and medical affairs before setting up SJ Solutions. SJ Solutions services span both consulting and contracting to provide solutions for drug safety, research, and other affairs relating to the running of a business within the pharmaceuticals industry. Seema has been helping companies in implementing the new EU legislation and is currently studying for her MSc in epidemiology. Seema, over to you.
Well, hi everybody. Thank you very much for attending webinar. This is on RSI maintenance and compliance. So if we look at reference safety information, so I think there are two separate areas really where we have mention of RSI, and one is in the post-marketing setting, where the RSI is considered to be the core safety information, and the other is in the interventional clinical trials, where here the RSI is included within the IB or the SPC, depending on the indication. And I think what's really important here is to understand that they're both slightly different with regards to their purpose and use, and we'll cover that now. So looking at post-marketing first, so here if we look at the definition from a GVP perspective, then we have a definition of the reference safety information as being the company core safety information, or CCSI. And this is included within the core data sheet, and it's the relevant safety information within the core data sheet. And this is a MAH defined document, so it's put together by the company and contains the minimum amount of safety information that should be available in any approved label globally. And it's acting as a baseline for safety data review within the organization for a medicinal product. Here it's important to understand that it's really used to define listedness, not expectedness. And as we go through, I'm sure those of you that are working within pharmacovigilance will understand that differentiation, but it is an important differentiation. So listedness is to do with your core safety information in the post-marketing setting, and expectedness is to do with regulatory reporting at a country level. Now, I think what constitutes the core safety information, generally, it's got a bit better, and more companies are quite similar in that regard as to what they would assume is the core safety information, but it will usually include your sections such as your contraindications, warnings and precautions, drug interactions, pregnancy, undesirable effects, and overdose as well. But there can be some differences in companies depending on what they would want to consider as part of safety remit. So I think when we're looking at the reference safety information in the post-marketing setting, you have your signal detection activities, and here is where your CSI is providing your baseline, so you can make that review, you can evaluate incoming data against any against the CSI and identify any areas that might need to be reviewed. And then after review of that signal, you can make a decision as to whether you need to update the core safety information, and then that will lead to an update to your SPC or your prescribing information thereafter. Now, when you're looking at periodic reporting here, as I was saying, it determines a listedness, so it gives you an idea of new information or emerging new safety information that you are seeing within the interval, and the impact of that with regards to your product and whether any changes need to be made. Importantly, as we've said, the CSI in this setting is not used for the expectedness assessment for expedited reporting. Here, that would be the local label in the country where you would need to make that assessment. Now, if we move on to the PSUR, you can see that normally within a PSUR, you have your reference safety information. This is your baseline safety information that you're using to see whether there have been any changes in the interval from a safety perspective for your product, for your marketed product. Usually you would use the core safety information, and that would be appended to the PSUR. However, if you don't have a core data sheet or core safety information, you may use, for example, the EU SPC, and what you would need to do is state exactly what is being used for your reference safety information, and you would need to append that to your PSUR so that whoever is reviewing the document can see what you have used for your baseline safety for your product overall. What you would use, though, is the version that's in place at the end of the reporting interval for listedness. And that is a little bit different to when you're looking at the development safety update report. And that does need to be borne in mind, that it should be whatever is in place at the end of the reporting interval. Now, when we look at RSI management in the post-marketing setting, it is really with regard to, I think, the core safety information. And if we look at what flows into really the core safety information, as we talked about briefly, signal assessments, where you're going to be wanting to add perhaps any adverse reactions to your undesirable effects section, or warnings and precautions, or contraindications. Not only that, regulatory requests come in where you're asked to look at specific areas, and then you need to make an assessment as to whether your core safety information needs to be updated or not. If you've got a product where you've got a generic or a competitor label, then you would need to look at your competitor labels as well and make sure that there is a process for assessing all of that, reviewing all of that, and feeding in to your core safety information so that it is always constantly up to date and relevant. And that process is extremely important because it feeds into updating your SPC and your prescribing information. And that is important because that really is the end goal of what you're trying to do here. You're trying to ensure that your healthcare professional and your patients have the right information, certainly from the healthcare professional side, to be able to make that decision on benefit risk overall. What you also need to do is make sure that you have a tracking system, and the tracking system should look at right from identification of anything that would need to be updated within the core safety information, the update to the core safety information, and how long that takes to get into your SPC or your PI, and the timeline that you would assign to those, again, depending on the type of information that's going in and the urgency, where 6 months really is the maximum that would be expected for information to go from your CSI and be available in the SPC and prescribing information. So I'm going to move on to a slightly bigger topic, because I know that certainly those working in the clinical trial setting, RSI kind of has different connotations in the interventional clinical trials area. So if we look at CT3, we can see that here very clearly there's a difference with regards to what the reference safety information means according to this document and in this setting. And here your reference safety information is to determine expectedness for regulatory reporting. So very different to the post-marketing setting. What you have are events that have been observed with your IMP, not those that are anticipated based on the IMP's pharmacological profile. And the RSI itself is not the document, it is information that's contained either within the SPC or the investigator's brochure, depending on what you're using and the indication for your IMP overall. Now, when you submit the covering letter to the National Competent Authority, you need to state what you're using for your reference safety information. So you can see we've moved on now into the interventional clinical trial setting, and it is really used here in this way for expedited reporting and to determine what should go to the regulatory authority, whereas before it was being used more in the post-marketing setting for determining what your safety profile and any updates to your safety profile overall. Now, if we look at what we use for the reference safety information, this will depend on the indication that the IMP is being used in the clinical trial setting. So if it is within an authorized indication, then you would use your RSI that's within the SPC. Now, if you have several SPCs, you would need to select the most appropriate one and justify as to why that SPC is the most appropriate. And then if you're using the IB, you would have a clearly identified section within the IB that is for the reference safety information. And here you would list the frequency and nature of the adverse reactions you would expect to see with your IMP. Now, as we said previously, for interventional clinical trials, the RSI is used for expectedness assessments for your suspected adverse reactions, so you can identify the SUSARs that need to be reported as required. It's not a summary of the safety profile of the IMP, and that information is captured in other parts of the IB, if you're using the IB, or within the SPC as well. And what you can have here within the IB certainly is you can have a tabular format of your non-serious adverse reactions. You could have the suspected serious adverse reactions that have occurred only once, because normally you would expect to see a SAR more than once for it to be considered expected with your IMP. And you would normally present this information in either the effects movements section or the summary of data and guidance for the investigator. It should also be clear, though, for the investigator as to what are the possible risks and adverse reactions, and if any specific tests or observations and precautions that are required with regards to the clinical trial, and that should be documented as well. So the reference safety information, when we look at what should be included, now this is based on what has been seen with your IMP and not what is anticipated based on knowledge of the IMP itself. You need to include reactions where there is a causal relationship with the IMP, and you can do this through comparison of incidence of the serious adverse reactions with the IMPs compared to placebo or compared to other IMPs, or even looking at individual cases as well. Normally, as I said previously, you would have a serious adverse reaction that's reported more than once for it to be included in the RSI, but there may be occasion where you would put in a serious adverse reaction that's only been reported once, but you would need to have a robust justification overall. And anyway, for all the reactions that are included in your RSI, you should have a justification as why it is relevant to include that, and think of that as expected with your IMP. So you would have a workup really that would detail the reaction, look at the evidence behind the association with the IMP, any other relevant information as well. And this would be used to support the addition of the reaction to the RSI and should be kept on file. Severity is not actually required per se. I mean, certainly per CTC requirements, that wouldn't be included within the RSI, but you do need to consider severity when you are assessing expectedness of any serious adverse reactions that have been seen. Importantly as well, you shouldn't use medical concepts or non-specific terms because they can be quite general. So for example, I've listed here rash infections. That's very general. You're going to have PTs that are going to be more specific, and it's not going to be helpful to have just rash infections. You need to be very specific about what you would consider as expected for your IMP. You would you would include PTs only, so PT should be used to define exactly what your expected terms are, and lower level terms under the PT would be expected as well. When you have an immunosuppressive, we know that this causes infections, although you couldn't put infections, as I stated above. What you should put in are the PTs that are associated with specific infections that have been seen with that immunosuppressive, and you would update that on an ongoing basis. So you can see quite clearly it is about what you've seen with the IMP, not what you expect to see. Shouldn't use broad terms, should be very specific. Okay. Now, if risk minimization measures are required, then this should be included in the protocol. So, for example, if you need frequent clinical tests, then that would be listed within the protocol and should be listed within the RSI as well. Right, now looking at fatal and life-threatening reactions. So generally, if we look at IMPs, these are not thought to cause fatal adverse reactions. These would normally be considered unexpected. Now, if there is a life-threatening reaction, then this should only be considered expected where you can show that there is a positive benefit-risk balance for the IMP. And even if you have had fatal or life-threatening reactions previously and seen that with your IMP, you would still normally not consider those to be expected. They would still be considered unexpected for regulatory reporting purposes. So as the RSI only includes those expected reactions, so if you do state that you have a life-threatening or fatal reaction, then it is it shows that the sponsor expects that degree of severity for that reaction. And, as I've been saying throughout, you always have to have a robust justification as to why it is appropriate to have that level of severity for the IMP as an expected event. And that needs to be documented. Now, when you have an IMP with a marketing authorization in the EU, a fatal reaction would only be considered expected when you have that fatal reaction clearly stated within 4.8 of the SPC. And if you have an IMP without a marketing authorization in the EU, then you really shouldn't have any fatal serious adverse reactions because they should all be considered unexpected. Now, if you have a fatal or life-threatening reaction, and this is added to the reference safety information, then there needs to be an update of the benefit risk assessment or statement for trial subjects, and risk minimization measures will need to be detailed as well in the protocol for the study or the trial. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't present information on fatal and life-threatening events. It just means that from an expectedness perspective and looking at the reference safety information, this is not the appropriate place to put that. It would need to go into other sections within the IB, and that's where information can be added to either the effect in human or summary of data and guidance for the investigator. So that information is there for the investigator, but it's not what you would consider as expected. So there are other ways of ensuring that information does go to the investigator. So if we look at the presentation now, normally you'd have a table as with a should be easily found within the documentation, easy to locate. You would have the system organ class PT using the latest MEDRA version, and then frequency should also be presented, and that should be on an aggregate level. Now, if you have different indications and you think that there is going to be a difference with regards to the expected events that you would see, then you should present separate tables and again justify as to why you would have that difference for the different indications. That should also be presented in the cover letter that goes to the National Competent Authority. Frequency should be presented as per ICH E2A, and standard categories of very common, common, rare, etc. should be used. Now, there may be certain situations where you are not able to actually give a frequency, and that could be because you've got a product that's in early development and you may not have enough numbers to be able to make that frequency calculation. And here what you should do is provide the number of serious adverse reactions with the number exposed, and that will help the investigator to be able to understand the exposure and numbers of reactions that have been seen. So this is just an example of an RSI table, and you can see we've got the number exposed here, got the SOC PTs here, and then you've got kind of frequencies there. Now, I did talk about severity and specificity before with regards to what would be considered expected, and it is important to bear in mind when you are looking at a term as to whether it really does meet the expectedness criteria. So these are just some examples. They're in the CTFG guidelines, but it gives an idea. If you have acute renal failure within your reference safety information and you get interstitial nephritis reported, you would not consider that as expected because this is more specific than acute renal failure. So you do need to take that into account when you are making those decisions. You can see for hepatitis and fulminant hepatitis from a severity perspective, that wouldn't be considered expected. So if you did make an expectedness decision and said that was expected, that would be incorrect. Now to touch on synonyms now. So some synonymous terms are okay, and here we have, sedation, somnolence, drowsiness, and they are meant to truly represent the same medical phenomenon and would be allowed within the reference safety information. But there are different forms of the same medical condition that would not be used synonymously, and this would include things like rash. So here we've got rash, generalized rash, maculopapular, that should say, and rash, papular, not popular, and pustular rash as well. And they're different. They're different kind of concepts. They shouldn't be considered synonymous at all. And it would not be considered appropriate to consider them the same and consider all of those expected if you had one as an expected term. And if we look at respiratory tract infection, if that's expected, if you had a report of lower respiratory tract infection, that wouldn't be considered expected, that would be unexpected. Now, the table, again, this is from the CTFG guidelines and shows what could be used synonymously. You can see here pneumonia, right upper lobe pneumonia, etc., and a couple of other terms here. Now, I think what I would say is that there's been a lot of interest with regards to use of synonymous terms, and there have been findings with regards to the inspection settings, specifically from the MHRA perspective, where synonymous lists have been used to say that certain reactions are expected because they're on a synonym list. And I think the MHRA's position is that's not really what they would expect, because what you're doing by using the synonym list is actually expanding your reference safety information, and therefore you are in the danger of underreporting from a SUSAR perspective. So if you've got a term, a PT, and you've got other PTs that you're saying are synonymous, and you then use your other PTs to say, yep, they're expected, if the MHRA haven't approved those other PTs as part of your reference safety information, they would say you could actually be underreporting because those are not considered expected from the MHRA perspective. So I think I would just say, be very cautious with regards to the use of synonyms and a list of events that are that are the same from a PT perspective. And if you do want to use one, I would just say that make sure that you do have approval in some way of the terms that you are using, so that you would not have that as an inspection finding and find that you are underreporting or could potentially be underreporting from the competent authority or MHRA perspective, because it's a lot of work to go back and correct that and look at what's been reported and not been reported. Now, when we look at the requirement to report all SUSARs, we know that the SAR is the reference safety information is used to determine whether a suspected SAR is expected or not, or meets the definition of a SUSAR and needs to be reported. So the RSI that is used should be the one that is in place at the time of the event, and you shouldn't downgrade the event when the RSI changes. So you could add something to the reference safety information, and now that reaction becomes expected. You would downgrade that, you would keep that as unexpected. And it's important that you don't use anything else apart from the reference safety information to make that decision. You shouldn't use anything else from the investigator's brochure. And as I said previously, it should be clearly marked, easy to find, to ensure that there's consistency in the decisions that are made with regards to SUSARs. So a little bit of guidance here on titles and locations. So here there's an example of a section title. You can see here italicized and underlined, and that can be used for your reference safety information. Normally it's located close to your summary of data and guidance for the investigator because it's easy then to find. And you need to identify the section to be used for reference safety information in the cover letter of your clinical trial application, and you should indicate that that is going to be used to assess expectedness and that it does not provide a comprehensive overview of the safety profile of the IMP. So it really is providing you with the events or the reactions that you would use to say that this is expected with my IMP. Right, so now we just briefly touch on which RSI to use. So if you are using your IMP within the terms of its licensed indication, then you would use the undesirable effects section in the SPC. And as I said previously, if you've got more than one, you would choose the most appropriate one with a justification. There are occasions when you can use a clearly separated section in the IB if you have an IB that covers global clinical trials, including those outside of the EU, and you have a marketing authorization within the EU. Now, if you have an IMP which is marketed but is being used outside of its marketing authorization, and you don't have an IB, you may still be able to use section 4.8 of the SPC, but you would need to justify as to why it's appropriate to use that section. And if you have an IMP that isn't marketed within Europe, and you would then have to ensure that you had an IB, and the reference safety information would be a section within the IB. Now, there may be some situations where you won't have any serious adverse reactions in your reference safety information. It could be that you're early on in clinical development, or it could be there's been reevaluation of your suspected adverse reactions and your serious adverse reactions, and they're not considered to be expected anymore, or where your drug actually or your IMP does not really lead to serious adverse reactions. You would still, though, need to have a section within your document as an reference safety information within the IB, and you'd have to have some text to say that no SARs are considered expected by the sponsor for expedited reporting, and also for identification of SUSARs within the DSUR. And there's some suggested text here. Now, when we look at amending your reference safety information, this is from the clinical trial perspective. Now, substantial changes or important changes would include things like new serious adverse reactions, any updates to frequencies, update to 4.8 of the SPC if you're using your SPC, or section 4.8 as your reference safety information. And here you would need to ensure that you had a substantial amendment for any of these changes before you can implement the updated reference safety information for assessing expectedness. You wouldn't need a substantial amendment for things like formatting changes or modification of exposure rates that don't actually change your category. So, things that don't change your the adverse reactions that are presented and that kind of information. So you wouldn't need an amendment for that. Now, you need the amendment because you've got a change to the reference safety information, which constitutes then a change to benefit risk or risk benefit, and that needs review by the National Competent Authority or Regulatory Authority before that is used and before that is implemented. If you have an SPC that's updated, so section 4.8 is updated, and you would submit that, you would get your variation, you would then need to ensure that you submit that as a substantial amendment for your study or your trial, and you would have to wait for approval of that before you can implement that and use that for your reference safety information for expectedness assessment for your clinical trial. So you can't just implement it as soon as you get that variation and say, yes, it's regulatory approval of the SPC, so we're okay to use that. That's not what that approval is for. You need to send that separately as a substantial amendment for your clinical trial. When you have your RSI and your IB, normally you would update on an annual basis, and you would try and do this after your DSUR, so you can review the data from the DSUR and use that to justify anything that you would add into the reference safety information in your IB. Now, when you do update your RSI, you need to send a cover letter with the update, and if there's no protocol amendment, you need to highlight where in the protocol the risk minimization measures are covered, and whether you need to update the informed consent form or anything else needs updating as well. If you have a DSUR submission, you need to state that, and you submit your track change versions of your IB and any other documents where changes have been made if needed. And it is recommended that you submit this to all member states at the same time. Obviously, you will then get hopefully approval around the same time as well. So I'm just going to touch very briefly on the DSUR here, and here the reference safety information is a bit similar, I think, to the PSUR, where you're looking at identification of SUSARs, new information that you've seen in the interval setting. It gives kind of an overview of the important safety information during the interval setting and the impact on the safety profile of the IMP, taking into account what you knew at the beginning of the period. So here you need to use the reference safety information that's in effect at the start of the reporting period for the development safety update report. And you would highlight the suspected serious adverse reactions that are unexpected as per that RSI that was in effect at the start of the reporting period. So you can see here it will highlight to you all of the SUSARs that are not considered expected as per the RSI that is being used for the DSUR. Again, a slightly different way of using your reference safety information here. Now, for combination products, you can have a combination reference safety information, or you can use multiple IBs and SPCs. But if you do use multiple IBs and SPCs, then there could be issues with regards to this because you're assessing causality for the combination rather than the individual IMPs. And sometimes it is easier to have a combination reference safety information. So when we look at clinical trial reference safety information management, I think it is really important to have a really good oversight of the whole process, and you need to know exactly what is approved, which reference safety information is approved for which study, in which country, and you need to have a handle over that completely. You need a process for updating the reference safety information and making sure you get that approval before implementation. And make sure you're using the right RSI, for the right clinical trial in the right country. So coordination, as you can see, is extremely essential to ensure that compliance is really maintained in this setting. So just to summarize, I think if we look at the post-marketing and the clinical trial setting, it is quite different as to how the documents are used. And I think it is confusing because people talk about reference safety information, but actually it's RSI being used in different contexts. So for post-marketing, we're using the core safety information. It's for listedness, not for expedited reporting. It's really about managing the safety profile of your marketed product and looking at new information that comes in against that baseline. In the clinical trial setting, you've got your RSI, which is included in your IB and SPC, and that drives regulatory reporting. So that drives the reporting to the regulatory authorities, identification of SUSARs. It's a different way of using reference safety information. However, you do also have your development safety update report, which is quite similar to the PSUR, and here you're using that as, again, a bit of a baseline with regards to new information that you see in the interval for your IMP and for managing the safety profile of that IMP. I think what's important is to understand the purpose of the document that you're using, make sure that you have justification for whatever you're using, and I think that will ensure that you stay and maintain compliance from that perspective. So thank you. I'm going to end there. Are there any questions? Okay, there doesn't seem to be any questions, but please